You're listening to The Adventuring Party. Talking about gaming the Irish way.
Okay, welcome to the party. I am Still Savage.
I'm Shane.
I'm Conrad.
I'm Eoin.
And I'm Icecream.
Conrad, we've asked you to come on the show because we wanted to have a word with you about your little podcast. It's a nice little podcast. It'd be an awful shame if anything happened to it.
It would indeed.
You've stepped into the gaming podcast space. That's kind of our space. So maybe
we wouldn't want things to get violent now, would we?
Smooth.
I'm a man of peace.
I lay them down and Shane, trusty Shane, picks them up. We are, of course, we're here to talk because you put out a very interesting episode about the use of cheap violence in RPG games. And you had and we're going to link to that obviously at the top of the show notes. If you're listening to this, gentle listeners, I highly recommend you go and enrich yourself for another 40 odd minutes. But don't feel like you can't listen to this podcast first. So what is cheap violence in an RPG, Conrad?
Cheap violence, to my mind, is violence that is meaningless. It's sort of the equivalent of popcorn in the cinema, in that there is no, you just consume it. There's no actual meaning, or nothing has changed as a result of this act of violence. And the stereotypical example of this would be go in dungeon, kill lots of orcs. And there's a value to that, let's say in something like a computer game, because there's a certain amount of skill to it. But you get much more from your game, to my mind, if you, in that just presenting a series of fights is not enough. And it can very quickly get boring. So the idea is that firstly, you should try and look for other sources of drama in your game. You should look for interpersonal drama. You should look for exploration, survival, role playing, that sort of stuff. Those are all great sources of conflict that don't involve immediately escalating to lethal force. That when you do use violence, you should use it for a reason, and that there is more. You get more from it if there's some sort of emotional content to it, and it's not just, well, these goblins are here, we want their stuff, let's kill them.
Okay, that's a fairly concise synthesis of what you had to say. You've expanded on all of those points during the course of the episode you released. So I think I kind of hope that if we go around the table now, we might get a couple of yays and nays. I mean, do we agree with Conrad here? Eoin?
So my take on it would be very much that combat is a core activity in nearly every RPG. Only the very avant-garde ones won't include anything about combat, and at most they'll tut at you and label the chapter assault or murder or something like that. It's in every RPG, and in almost every RPG module, critically, there are assumed combat encounters. I'm sure there are people who have gone through games like Fighting Nobody and resolving all difficulties diplomatically, but in nearly every module that's written, there's a fight in it. Now, I agree with Conrad in cheap combats are not a good idea necessarily, especially boring, kind of perfunctory combats. But combat's a very valuable tool as a GM to give the GM a break in a session. That you may have been talking for 2 hours and your throat's a bit dry and you're feeling a little low energy and you're like, you know what's be great now? A bunch of orcs came through the door with axes and I'm going to roll initiative and they're going to fight the orcs for a little bit. And that'll just give me a break to think about what else I've been doing this thing and just let me run the combat a bit. And I'm good enough at combat that I can run it kind of on auto. And that's a good thing. The bad thing is when the combat itself isn't entertaining. And we'll talk about that later.
Okay, I think there's some very good points there. Ice Cream, how do you like a little combat in your game, or a little game in your combat?
Well, it largely depends on whether I'm playing or GMing, because they're very different experiences. I'm going to come in on the GM side first, and as Eoin said, having a combat gives the GM a wonderful break, especially in a 3 or possibly 3+ hour session. But it's not just getting tired during running the game that combat helps with. Combat also helps a lot with reducing prep time. I actually think in the long run, it can often be more engaging to be playing a session where there's a point you realize, God, we don't have to do any of the fighting here. There's kind of a rich social dynamic going on behind the scenes that we can leverage in order to, attain our goals or complete our quest without needing to draw swords. But putting all that stuff together is a lot of work on the GM's part. And sometimes it can be easier to say, you get attacked by 2d4 goblins per turn. And just run it through that way. So that in terms of making life easier for your GM, I think combat can be very valuable. I've had a tendency as a player to enjoy those sessions more where I don't roll a dice, where there isn't any combat. But those sessions I have found are a rarity, and combat, even kind of meaningless combat, can be very fun. But after you've played enough games, I think there can be a point where you think, oh, we're going to fight these guys. Oh, okay, I thought we were going to talk to them. No, that's cool. I'll stab them.
It does tend to be quite binary, you're right. And once it's been revealed that you're sitting on one or other side of that coin, I think we do sort of snap into rote behaviour and rote ways of thinking about it.
It
Shane,
changes your player thought. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. But Shane, you've got notes. Do you care to share?
I have far too many notes. I have about 3 or 4 pages of notes on 2 pages. So I don't know how much useful stuff I can actually extract from them. But one of the things that keeps coming back to my mind as I think about this topic is not so much who's to blame as to what the structures of our game, the games we play, what the structures encourage encourage people to do. Because very often, when you say something is violence is cheap, I tend to think of it more in terms of violence is cost effective, and it can be an awful lot easier, both in game and out of game, to use violence than to engage with other parts of the play experience. And there's a question of, if you want to change the amount or efficiency of violence in your game, part of that is going to be on the game designer, part of it's going to be on the GM, and part of it is going to be on the players. But I don't think you can leverage all the blame or what have you onto one group.
Okay, yeah. So there's an awful lot to discuss. Do I like cheap violence in an RPG? I guess as I get older, the answer becomes increasingly no, not really. But how cheap is it? Certainly, I've been doing a lot more running than playing at the moment, and I agree with that point about Owen's point about how it gives you a chance to sit back for a minute and take stock while the players sort of move their pieces around the board and kind of think to themselves or discuss among themselves, oh, if you go there and I'll cast this spell and all the rest. It does form a nice kind of fire break, because role-playing and answering all the questions and being all the people can be quite intensive. It's quite intensive labour for any GM. However, I think it is... there is this thing where we automatically click into this combat mindset and forget about the larger realities. And GMs and players fall victim to that. And I have to say, I've a great deal of time for Conrad's arguments about how consequences and how consequential combat should be. It could bear an awful lot more thinking about even simple skirmishes should play into the game in terms of the wider narrative, in terms of how the players relate to local authorities, as Conrad mentioned, or how they're perceived off of the back of the resolution of that combat. Were they merciful? Were they ruthless, etc.?
Yeah. Well, the problem there is that consequences represent GM work and player investment, and I don't want to be disparaging of the average player or anything, but an awful lot of people will play RPGs in order to get away from the consequences of real life. And as much as we want people to role play as fully functional adults who are cognizant of their environment, a lot of people are happy enough with it being a leisure activity. And the idea that they have to, curb their behaviors might sound a little bit like too much. Why the reason they...
If I understand the argument correctly, it's not so much that the consequences have to be realistic, as much as the consequences can be just as entertaining and fantastical as the combat itself.
Oh, absolutely. But
throw fireballs, get magic prison,
Yeah, that's true, but you still have to... that case, the consequences require design on the part of the player, of the GM mostly.
Yeah.
To be engaging and interesting and part of the game. The problem is, not all GMs are have the cognitive spark is completely the wrong word. They don't have the improv ability to, or perhaps they may not have the setting knowledge to think of, well, what would be a good and interesting consequence in this situation? If they are slitting the throats of all the orcs, what's a good and interesting way to bring that across as a consequence of their actions?
Now, you mentioned orcs there, and that actually brings me to where I think there's the apples and oranges aspect of what Conrad had to say. But before I dive into that, I do have to hand back to Conrad. Obviously, there's a diversity of opinion here. Have you had any sort of reaction to your output, or has any other thought formed with you since you did the episode?
I think that there is a certain element of apples and oranges here, because my background is mainly Call of Cthulhu and GURPS and sort of games that are set in the real world or in historical settings, or Savage Worlds as well. But I tended to play or run Savage Worlds in historical settings. And those are systems that are perhaps less so Savage Worlds, but are more lethal than Dungeons and Dragons. So fights are by simple necessity are more consequential, because the chances of character death are much higher. But so that I suppose there is a difference there of coming from different starting assumptions. But my objection to violence is not an objection to violence per se, but an objection to cheap violence. And I think, yes, absolutely, there is a place for just having a dungeon, going in and murdering some orcs and stealing their stuff. And that is a wholesome entertainment for all the family on occasion. And God knows I've done enough of it myself. But perhaps maybe it's an age thing. As I get older, I find I'm just less interested in just the mass slaughter of even things that aren't sort of living, thinking creatures with souls. And I just get tired of all the killing. I think, yes, you can absolutely have I'm not saying that, the player characters have killed someone, you must descend on them with the law. But you could have a consequence like, okay, hang on a second. I've completely forgotten the name of Gene Wilder's character from Blazing Saddles, but you're the fastest gunman in the West. Now other guys are going to go seek you out and try and prove that, oh no, they're the quickest on the draw. Like, that is a consequence of violence that you could...
You attract more violence.
That could attract more violence. Or actually the Kung Fu Panda movies feature huge amounts of fighting, but that the fighting is consequential. It has emotional content. It is meaningful. The different characters do things in different ways, and there are very few cheap fights, or those fights that are there so that the players can show off. Let's say if it was a role playing game, and there's a value for the players being able to sort of peacock occasionally, but I would use that as an example of the use of consequential violence, because there is no sort of simple, to use a film analogy, the end of Commando is, I think, about 7 minutes of just constant slaughter. It just gets boring after a while. And then you compare it to, let's say, Kung Fu Panda or Where Eagles Dare, where something different is happening in each instance. There's a fight on a cable car. There's a fight in a hallway. There's a fight, oh God, they've got a machine gun. That, like, the fights are interesting. And they are also meaningful and consequential. There is something at stake, and sort of things grow out of it. It's not just sort of popcorn to shovel into your face. And I can absolutely accept as a GM that there are times you need to take a breather, but I generally find what I tend to do in that situation is I tend to present the characters with the problem. Usually, for example, oh, you need to ambush some guys. I'm going to the loo. I'll be back in 5 minutes, and you better have a plan.
Eamon, you answered a question that I've been planning on asking, which was, like, does throwing a good planning question at players eat as much, if not more, time than a regular combat? But there was just something I wanted to comment on, which is that at least two of the people here have commented on this matter as applies to the age of the people involved. I'm not sure if there's direct corollary between how young you are and how much you want to indulge in mindless violence in your RPGs, but maybe it's a question of how many games you've played. I had direct experience of this fairly recently, where I ran some introductory D&D for two young gentlemen of my acquaintance who were both around 22 at the time. And I was pitching kind of classic D&D stuff at them, not too complex. I wanted them to go and clear a dungeon of kobolds, but I had put a lot of effort into the background of the kobolds. They spoke the same language as one of the players, who was a dragonborn. There were political ramifications to their actions. There were female and children kobolds present. There were various different ways of solving the problem, and the two guys did not care. They were just like, ooh, kobolds, we slaughter them all. All they wanted to do was pull out swords and spells and kill everything. And that was the game they wanted to play. Again, I'm not going to assume that it was because they were in their early 20s, but I don't think it was nothing to do with it.
I having been present, I think you're right in that it has a lot to do with how much previous experience you have. If you're handed a hammer, then every problem starts to look like the solution to every problem looks like a nail. And because your first brush with most RPGs is going to be something fairly combat heavy, then you're naturally set up by the rules, by the entire conventions of role playing. You're sort of set up to look at it and go, right, what's on my character sheet I can use here? Swords and spells. That's how we'll solve this.
Well, there's also the point that for a lot of people, the ability to use violence to solve problems is in itself quite novel at first.
True.
We live in a phenomenally peaceful society, and are generally swear off violence after the first time you get a bloody nose at school. But that sort of leaves this kind of gap in people's experience and the ability to solve problems. Thus gains a certain veneer of
That is a very
quality all of its own.
That is a very good point, Shane. And absolutely, there is an element of wish fulfillment and power fantasy there that's very attractive. But I suppose,
For a time.
Yeah, for a time.
So the other thing that you touched on, Conrad, is that your background being in more sort of games that center in maybe a human or close to regular world, and then we, of course, here at the Adventuring Party tend to focus a lot on classic sword and sorcery. Yeah, in the Adventuring Party on the table is essentially far from civilization, far from the rule of law, and far from anything that looks like a human that is protected by the norms of society, the laws of the land, or the edicts of their gods. It is very, very simple to justify to any sort of character. Oh, I mean, these things must die because they are, as you pointed out, not considered fully people. But the further along this track of thought I go, the more I sort of think about, okay, the opposite of cheap violence has to be expensive violence. Now, who pays the cost? And so I think it's a question for players and people who are running games. If you want to have good, high-quality violence, what are the things you need to think about?
You need to have, to paraphrase Conrad in his own podcast, risk and consequence are going to be vital tools. I don't think you can, particularly if you're going to accentuate this sort of expensive violence aspect, you're going to need both player buy-in and GMs willing to put in the work, because the GM will have to put in the work to install consequences to everything, positive consequences and negative consequences, and make sure that when you do roll that initiative dice, that the world will be different afterwards. But also you need the players to be up for this sort of consideration. That they are, at the very least, they have to be up for the challenge of planning when and where they use their fireballs and +3 broadswords and such. It's
a very uncanny feeling to have my mind read. That's exactly where I was heading there. Let me see. Owen.
Yes.
How do we improve the quality of violence when we play our sword and sorcery games?
All right. Well, okay. The first thing is, if your best session is one where you never roll the dice, you are playing a mechanically uninteresting game. Mechanics in games should make the game more fun. They should make it more interesting, and engaging with the mechanics should be fun in its own right. If it is not, you are not playing a good RPG. Because, we're got all these advantages to playing combat in RPGs that don't exist in a computer game. You have a responsive AI at the other end that can alter the world dynamically in any way. These should be amazing. Fights should be amazing in RPGs because you've got a GM that can dynamically respond and alter and change stuff and go, okay, well, I'm going to do this now in response to this or whatever else. So you've got this, you should be able to evolve and make, combat should be exciting. Now, in reality, combats often aren't. They often get very perfunctory because of the way that the RPGs kind of approach the problem of combat. And one of the things that occasionally happens is combats are too easy because they're worried about players dying a lot. If you want combat to feel dangerous, combat actually has to be dangerous, or it has to appear really dangerous. It mightn't actually be really dangerous, but it needs to appear really dangerous. If you want to think for a second, what's the most dangerous RPG you've ever played? In terms of the chance of a player dying in combat is extremely high. Now, Cthulhu is a classic example of being a very dangerous one because you don't have a lot of hit points, you die at 0, and guns do a lot of damage. And then monsters do a tremendous amount of damage. Cthulhu, it is too easy to die in combat. That's one of the problems with Cthulhu. It's too easy to die. So it's actually not as scary. because in some ways, because you can die so easily. You can die to just like, okay, a guy nails me with a shotgun, my character's dead. Which is, sort of realistic, but actually sort of not. There was some interesting stats on gunfights once done, where there was, I think, 27 bullets exchanged between 3 participants in a gunfight. No major injuries were sustained, and this gunfight took place within a police car. So, Cthulhu is an example of a very dangerous one, because the monsters do a lot of damage, guns do a lot of damage, people don't have a lot of hit points, and you die at 0. And if you look at modern Cthulhu iterations, they've rode back on that a little bit. They've given people opportunities to save themselves and so on. So, Feng Shui, for me, is actually a good one in terms of you can do a fight, and you can win a fight, and you can die after the fight. Because there's a whole mechanic there of up checks. When you go down, you have to get back up again, and you can get back up and get back in the fight. But there's then a chance you're going to die after the fight's over. You're going to have your heroic last words, and that's it. So when we played Feng Shui, we actually had characters who were dying fairly regularly. And not like, constantly, but fairly regularly, so which was interesting. So Rough regular is super random. Wolfrup Third Ed was the most dangerous one I played. Everyone will tell you it wasn't because there were cards, but they're crazy because that was the one that played without fate points. Whereas Wolfrup was always included extra lives. Like, do you guys have a most dangerous RPG you played in terms of combat?
It'd probably be Dark Heresy.
There was a one in the 90s called Stock's Light that was super realistic. The guys who wrote it, I think they were a Northern Irish crowd, but they were super into their guns, so everything was statted out like crazy. And yeah, you'd die in a gunfight. That was as soon as someone got the drop on you were dead. Shadowrun Second Edition, I recall, being fairly easy to die. You had a lot of, especially once automatic weapons were introduced. Cheap violence, expensive violence. So this is expense at the cost of the players losing characters.
Sort of.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in on one of the point that Owen's made there. But I couldn't agree more in that your fights should be dramatic, they should be tense, they should be interesting. One of the points I made in the episode of Century and Fourpence is that I view emotion as an investment in character as what the chips that you bring to the game. If you've ever played poker without money, it's a dull and boring and meaningless game. And fights in RPGs without character investment, which is, I think, what Owen's getting at with it's too easy to die in Call of Cthulhu. I would argue that that's a keeper problem, but I see his point. But that the investment that you put in the character is what makes the fight exciting, because you are facing something that is a risk.
I'd absolutely agree, but there's a corollary to the point of combat being really dangerous in Call of Cthulhu, which is what players learn to do almost immediately is they learn to use the most dangerous weapons, and they learn to ambush people. Because the best status effect you can put on a bad guy is dead, and if they're taking on cultists, which is what you should be taking on most of the time in Call of Cthulhu, because you don't want to overuse the big gribbly monsters. Guys with Tommy guns who know how to use them, waiting for ambushes, are the leading cause of death of cultists, and
I am perfectly
that's what you teach.
I am perfectly okay with that.
Absolutely, but that's what you teach the players what to do. And they learn how to fight with overwhelming force, delivered as quickly as possible, as fast as possible. And then combat becomes kind of one note. Now, you can switch it up in Cthulhu a bit, you can throw in a Shoggoth, but then the problem is you actually have to come up with a way for the players to survive the fight with the Shoggoth, or be okay with the players dying a lot. Because I know they were going along good guns and they ran into a Shoggoth, and then they were like, okay, how do we kill this thing? You know? And that was one of the most memorable ones.
I think if you're looking to Cthulhu for mechanically interesting combat, you may be playing the wrong game. But Feng Shui would be your only man there.
So when the combat system is being built, for interesting combat to work, it has to actually be a series of meaningful choices, not just get there fastest with the mostest. Like, what we do, we kick open the door, you three fire your submachine guns that you specialised in, and if anybody's still alive, I guess I'll pick them off with my pistol. But they should be all dead at that stage. And if you make combat super dangerous, the player's approach to it will be to just constantly look for ambushes, which is interesting from a tactical point of view, but it actually doesn't make for interesting combats. It means that the GM puts a bunch of guys on the board, and the players are like, okay, we hit these guys, and these guys are all dead now. And the GM's like, well, what do I do? Do I start kind of countering this with the same sort of tactics? Which one? I'm just killing the players. You need to find a way for violence to be dangerous, but at the same time, not so dangerous that a degenerate metagame arises.
I would dispute that. I as a GM love watching a player plan come together like a Swiss watch, and then usually lose a spring somewhere about two-thirds of the way through. And you know, it just warms the cockles of my heart when I can do that. I'm so proud of them. But I think Savage, Shane, Cian, do you have anything to weigh in here?
Well, let's step around the table just one more time before we finish. So, Shane.
I would certainly say that if you want... the consequence of your violence should not just be more violence. The consequence of you fireballing the shop shouldn't just be, a whole bunch of guards show up to have another fight. The consequence of you killing goblins should be that the next goblins are more angry. You need to think about more interesting consequences than that people change tactics or try diplomacy or try leverage. This is where I'm getting at with the whole GM, idea of GM work and being involved, is that GM has to all of a sudden work on making up interesting consequences to give to the players. And you can't just be, the fight's harder or there's more guys. If you do that, you'll just end up in the cycle that Eoin was talking about, where the players will respond with even more violence, and you go all the way down to Murder Hobo Junction. Okay. So you need to be cognizant of what your consequences are going to instill in the players. I would also say that you do need to have an appreciation for what the mechanics of your game are encouraging. A lot of the problems people have with D&D and D&D style combat is that D&D is designed around resource management. It's designed around, those 5 goblins might not have been very important, but you used up all your spells, so now when the 30 more goblins come along, you have less to play around with. And so, while you want to avoid having meaningless fights, you do have to be aware that if you're just going to have one big fight with all of the meaning in the world, that the game system might not respond so well to that.
Okay. Icecream, any thoughts or anything you want to recommend to our listeners?
I have some final thoughts. Again, it was something I mentioned earlier about there being a difference here between playing and GMing this. As a player, I absolutely love combat. But there are limits as to what Shane was saying there about there being this kind of ferocious, lengthy, interchained sequence of combats, which is it's one of my big problems with Fifth Ed as a system, is that you kind of read how they think an adventuring day is meant to go, and they're like, on your 6th combat, I'm like, my God, how much of your day do you spend fighting? There's got to be time for something else. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit there, but I thought that I had at the very start, and it was something I wanted to kind of finish off my personal exploration of this topic on, was that as a GM, I'm not particularly good at running combat. I find it very tricky, and I frequently make mistakes. So the game that I found combat most interesting, engaging, and easy to run, and also be consequential, was Numenera. Because when talking about expensive fights, in generally the bill for that is paid by the GM, but in Numenera all of the dice rolling was shunted across to the players, which gave the GM a huge amount more time to think about what he wanted to do in the fight and be more creative and do interesting things. So I felt that the combats, even your regular just 10 o'clock monster, if you wanted to do that combat, tended to be more interesting because the GM had more time to think about it and be creative during play. And also, Numenera had the mechanic where the resources that you lose attacking someone are also the resources that you lose if you get hit. You beat enemies by throwing your hit points at them. So I found that my players naturally began to veer away from a combat. They were like, my God, beating these guys is going to be as costly as being beaten by them. Let's see if we can avoid this fight. So those two things combined, I thought gave the combat in Numenera, just from a design perspective, it gave it some consequence and some risk and some punch. So I thought that was inherent to the game system, which made combat, I thought, more of a joy in that game than most other games I've played.
Good recommendation. Yeah, I think it is interesting that there is a firm sort of cost to winning in the Numenera system. It'll be interesting to see in years to come how Monty Cook's ideas are picked up on. Eoin, come back to you now. Is there a sort of recommendation you want to make, or a final thought on something other than cheap combat?
I think you need to put a little bit of time into some set pieces. Try and not litter things with combat and make it take away it being kind of special. Don't do too much, don't do too little, and find the right number for yourselves and your players, and then have a think about, like, is this working out mechanically? Is this interesting mechanically? Are people enjoying this mechanically or not? And then have a think about, like, having consequences or having bad guys that respond to what's being done is valuable because it causes the players to reevaluate their tactics and reevaluate what they're doing. Both from an actual, my God, we're monsters way. And also, ever since we went out of the Fireball heavy portfolio, a lot more guys are showing up wearing asbestos. We might have to reconsider things. So just, be dynamic and be willing to change stuff up.
Word gets around. I think what I'm taking from all of this, and it's something I've tried to express in my own GMing, is I tend to run stories. Not that I want to railroad players, but more in a sense I want to build a world that has a story that the players are in. So I like to make sure that my combats advance the story. That you're not in a fight just for the sake of fighting, but that there's something about how the fight ends that will inform the players as to what the story is, or will allow them to shape the story in some way. And I think that's another way to sort of avoid, because you can still throw a bunch of orcs on the table, but as long as the players have a sense that they may have depleted the resources of the enemy or capture a combatant who reveals something to them that advances the story, then it's you can possibly have the best of both worlds in terms of getting a little bit of a breather at the table, and also knowing that the consequences of what happens, even if they do end up slaughtering everything and sort of having a jolly old time, that there is a consequence in the sense that the players learn something, or the story moves forward, or the plot is pushed along. So I'd just like to thank Conrad for coming on and sort of indulging us while we tore up the groundwork he'd laid down. Conrad, where can we find you and your noble podcast?
You can find me on Spotify. You can find me on Anchor .fm / Conrad Kinch. Or if you search for Send 3 and Fourpence plus podcast, you'll get me. And I presume there will be a link in the show notes.
I'm sure we can hornswoggle one or two of them in. This has been the Adventuring Party. We've been very happy to have Conrad Kinch on as our guest. We have at the table today, we've had Shane Scar, we've had Icecream, and we have had our own Eoin, who's returning to us to sort of give us some mechanical wisdom. I think you've made some interesting points, Eoin. It's certainly got me thinking about how to use the mechanics of any given combat to sort of drive the story forward. And that's about it for this week, folks. So you will find a whole bunch of links in the show notes as to where to find us. We are using Discord tonight to record this, as we are still in the grip of a global lock-in, which entering its third week does not turn out to be as fun as I'd hoped. So join us there on our Discord server. You can find us on YouTube, you can find us on Spotify, on Libsyn, and all the usual places. But
and if you have something to say, you can dump it into SpeakPipe.
Yeah, you come and shout at the SpeakPipe. So
say it to our faces, you cowards.
Or give us some suggestions for what we might talk about next. Because at this point we have nothing but time. So with that said, and hopefully your next combat will be one that is mechanically rich, takes place in an interesting place against interesting opponents, and has dire consequences. But on that note, I'm going to say that this party is over. You've been listening to The Adventuring Party. You can find us at theadventuringparty.net. There you'll find show notes for the episode you just listened to, and you can find links to other places on the internet where we tend to hang out. We are on Facebook at The Adventuring Party. You can follow us on Twitter at AdventuringPTY, or if you head for YouTube, you can search for The Adventuring Party. If you'd like to shout at us, then head over to speakpipe.com/The Adventuring Party and leave a short message. If you want to contact us by email, send us a note to party@theadventuringparty.net. Now, this whole kit and caboodle has been released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike version 3 license. Anyways, give us a like, give us a subscribe, please share this episode or any other episode you've liked with your friends, and we hope we'll see you back here next week.